Alright, what about this one? Nia asked, before holding an artist's rendition of a small primate species that had hands with 3 thick fingers on the end of all 8 of their arms and or legs. It was pretty hard to distinguish between the two, if there was a distinction at all. Their fur had a muted green, shrubbery-like colour, and their face was elongated, almost pushing them into lemur territory, visually, although they didn't have a tail to match. They did, however, have a matching set of 2 green, V-shaped irises in each eye that together formed something that looked a bit like a bird's footprint, although the rest of their dark face looked fairly normal to James's eyes, which basically just meant it was bilateral symmetric, and features usually appeared in sets of 2 at most. Truth be told, he only knew that this was a primate species because he recognized the species, not because it actually looked all that much like a primate to him. The galactic orders were quite generous with what species they classified as looking similar and filling a similar niche, a lot more so than he would have been. Still, he wasn't here to criticize galactic categorization, so he briefly inhaled so he could answer. Grassogap. Primates from the standard world, so Ocote. Pretty close to the core worlds, but didn't make the cut ultimately, mostly because they only joined the community so late. These days their main influence in the galaxy is their expertise in nanotechnology, and the cultivation and export of the fruits of the Tshirt trees, which so far could only be cultivated on their homeworld for unknown reasons, and have therefore become an expensive delicacy highly sought after, mostly by other primate species. He left out the part where he was quite sure that getting these trees to grow on other planets would most likely be easy enough with just a tiny bit of modification. During his more intense learning about other parts of the galaxy, that he had so far known too little about, the same concept of an entire market that had long been established being easily overthrown by minor interference into some plants or animals' inheritance had come up quite a bit, and he honestly didn't know if he feared or looked forward to the changes that could wash over the galaxy, once humanity would manage to make genetic engineering a more common practice. Correct, Nia meanwhile confirmed what he already knew, while putting the picture she held out to him away and shuffling it into a larger stack of index cards. After a bit of shuffling, she pulled out a new card, turning it in his direction. And this one? James barely even needed to glance at it, as his eyes immediately fell onto the 5 large black eyes, the bright red crown of devolved gills around the head, the pinkish mottled skin that was covered over and over in fleshy villi, and the 8 spindly limbs that were placed along the laterally flattened body. This one he was all too familiar with. Arxogeritarian, he replied quickly, as if he was firing a shot. Named after their home core world, Arxogeru. Don't ask me where the terror comes from, and bestowed with that name by the community since they are, interestingly, one of the very few species who have not given themselves any sort of name in any of their own languages. They are Urudela, belonging to the founding species of the current iteration of the galactic community, and currently mostly contribute to it in an administrative fashion. Also interestingly, they are almost all born as females at the beginning of their life, with a ratio of the sexes of about 14:1. However, later in their life, any female Arxogeritarian will naturally transition into a male once all their eggs have been used up. Notable members of the species include the now acting Councilman, Ocote, who is an absolute prick and creepy as fuck, but somehow still the least annoying one of the people who had held me captive on Ostrinichar for a long while. After he was done rattling off details, he raised an eyebrow at his sister, feeling like the ones he had personal experience with might not be the best off-worlders to test him on. Come on, he commented with a bit of cocky confidence. Give me a hard one. Nia rolled her eyes, but instead of shuffling the card she held in her hand back into the stack, she put it aside and began to rifle through the stack personally, instead of shuffling it this time. Meanwhile, while she seemingly looked for something that could be hard enough for him to crack, Tuya picked up the card she had just put down, and lazily inspected the picture as well as the cliff notes written on an extra card, to see how many of the listed details James had actually named. On her cheek and along her neck, thick white bandages covered big parts of her skin, right where the deep claw scars she had gotten back on Dunamur would usually have been visible, after she had taken a trip to the doctor earlier that morning to hopefully have them removed, after she and Nia had decided that the scar-ridden look wasn't for her quite yet. "You started memorizing these 2 days ago," she mumbled, while her eyes flew over the text, her expression narrowing more and more, as her gaze turned more and more unbelieving of what she read there. "How the hell are you doing that?" James just chuckled, while his sister on the other hand sighed. "He's always been a straight-A student," she informed her girlfriend, with a mildly disapproving tone, while she herself went over card after card, seemingly trying to find a specific one. "I've stopped questioning how he does it. Stuff just sticks in his head." Well, that was giving a bit too little credit to his memorization techniques, but James wasn't really in the mood to argue or try to make himself look like such a hard learner. He knew that he seemingly had some natural advantage when it came to learning, and he wasn't going to downplay that fact in infuriating pretend modesty. Then, Nia suddenly looked up as she had seemingly found the card she was looking for. "Got it," she exclaimed, before slowly turning it towards James. "Now, what's this one?" The almost sinister and deeply satisfied look on her face told James that she truly believed that this would be a challenge for him, and so he sat up a bit straighter as he studied the card. First detail. The creature was wearing clothes. That was a good hint, since that was not a habit shared by many species in the galaxy. The next most notable thing was the colour. Dark purple fur covered almost the creature's entire body, with only some rare patches of dark pinkish skin being visible around the end of their limbs. Form-wise, they were winged bipeds with a vaguely humanoid form. The wings were bat-like, but had not fully developed palms that almost still looked like actual hands at their apex. The actual hands were four-fingered and had claws at their fingertips. The face had a pink, bat-like nose under blood-red eyes with yellow irises, housing slit pupils inside them. Around the head, the long fur whipped up into ear-like tufts that were almost as large as the head itself. However, by far the most notable feature was likely the thick, prehensile tail, that ended in what looked like a large pseudo-hand, with 3 massive fingers that all ended in thick claws. Admittedly, James had to stare at it for a while. He was almost sure that he didn't remember this species from his sessions of memorization, yet he still had the oddest feeling that he had seen it before. Bats weren't especially common in the galaxy, so he thought that he had remembered each one of the sapient ones. However, despite a nagging feeling in the back of his mind that he should know the name, these ones didn't ring a bell at all. "Of course, James mumbled, while he shifted to lean in a bit closer to the picture, almost making eye contact with the red eyes of the depicted being. "That's obviously... He was absolutely stumped. However, while he stared at the picture for what must have been a couple of minutes, he also got more and more sure that this species hadn't been part of his learning sessions, and therefore should not have been within his index cards. So, unless there had suddenly been a new species discovery while he had slept last night, that had since not been talked about on the news, the only logical answer was... "You made that one up, didn't you?" James asked, after what was an admittedly and embarrassingly long time of trying his best to dig up a name from his memory that he literally could not know. Nia almost immediately broke into happy snickering. "Yep," she confirmed delightedly, and turned the card so she could also have a look at it. "But it came out quite well, don't you think? Aren't they adorable?" James decided to not dignify that question, although that was indeed a very nice drawing, and instead grunted once while running his hand over his face. "Fine, I probably deserve that," he admitted, owning up to his own cockiness. "But can we please keep the confusing factors to a minimum? There are over 900 species I should know at some point. Adding ones that don't exist isn't making that any easier. And I promise you, I will now wait for these guys to come up at some point, any time I go for all the cards again. Having things easily stick in your head wasn't always just an advantage. Nia eventually calmed down from her sniggering and nodded. Alright, let's get back to it. So, don't need to show you this one, she commented, while she removed her fake card from the stack and looked at the next one beneath it, giving James a sneaky look, as she lifted the MIAT index card very briefly, before putting it back to the bottom of the stack. Seeing the next one, she rolled her eyes. And that's easy too, she commented, while lifting the picture of an enormous being that was covered over and over with dark red scales. James had barely glanced at it when he already said, Ligomordular, next. The only Class 5 Deathworlder in the galaxy was one of those things that were memorable enough to become basically a free answer, should the question ever come up. Nia just nodded, having obviously not expected him to struggle on that one, and just picked up the next card. They continued that song and dance for a little bit longer, with James naturally struggling with some of the obscurer, more average species that didn't leave much of a lasting impact upon view. However, he mostly struggled on details more so than on names. Mixing up homeworlds between two similar-looking ones, or completely forgetting what the main contribution to community of some of them was, but that would come over time. Overall, he was quite satisfied with himself and the amount of knowledge he had crammed into his head in a short time. When they finally finished up with the questions and answering, Tuya had just begun watching a recent news rerun that basically just recapped all of the crazy events that just kept piling onto each other during the last weeks. News networks were eating good at the moment. So, Saint Aldwyn. James's fellow lieutenant facetiously got his attention, while he pushed himself to his feet to maybe walk a few steps after sitting for the entire practice. Are there any news on your accepting or not accepting that invitation to the Monkey Club? James scoffed. Well, that's rude. It's obviously a monkey, ape and lemur club, he gave back while he stretched a bit. Although he did drop his joking tone moments later, when he actually replied, and, well, technically I don't need permission to accept an invitation, addressed specifically towards me. Getting the support and all clear from our superiors is just the same thing to do in my situation. As patron saint of artificial sapience, I have a little bit of a target on my back, even if it's just a fringe group that declare me as such. I mean, who knows how much context people not from Earth will have for that sort of nonsense. It had been a turbulent news day when that one was aired. Ambassador First Lieutenant James Aldwyn, declared patron saint of artificial sapience by new guide of Church of the Fell Saviour, Alexander Page. What a fucking headline indeed. Also decidedly untrue. The Church of the Fell Saviour didn't have a position in it that was called guide. Only a side branch of the religion that refused to give itself another name than the main group did. Generally, members of the original church refer to them as something like guided or guide followers, just to have any kind of distinction between them. Mostly because of the fact that, to most of the people of that particular faith, having something like a guide as a position above you telling you what to do entirely defeated the purpose of the church. Pray at home. Pray for yourself, and keep your prayer between yourself and God. Those were basically the guiding principles of the faith, which was what had once upon a time also attracted James to that particular branch of religion. They ostensibly believed that any religious leader, any prophet, any saint, any messiah, any saviour, as well-intentioned or malicious as they may be, would ultimately just guide people further away from God's actual will, as in their message. They would ultimately and unavoidably muddy its truth with whatever they themselves believed to be right or wrong, no matter how clearly God would state his intentions to them. Therefore, it was better to stay away from people like that altogether, and to just determine God's truth to yourself, which was something they had, in James's opinion, straight up stolen from the Bible. Obviously, they were picking and choosing what messages of God exactly they believed anyway, so it was hard to really nail down a constant faith in the church. The only things that were truly consistent in their teachings were: 1. The church officially acknowledged two failed saviors in their teachings, namely Jesus and whatever flavour of the adversary you believed in, although they usually chose either Lucifer or Satan or the devil as the name, likely based on their recognisability alone. 2. The church accepted Jesus as the Messiah and Son of God, hence calling itself a church, although that did not equate to also being God in their eyes, and even someone as close to God as him was not able to properly convey his message without mudging it, and therefore failed in his mission. 3. The church also saw the adversary as an attempted saviour, since he guided humanity to wisdom and understanding, even though they obviously also acknowledged that the thing he tried to save them from was actually God's will, and he therefore led humanity to sin. He was therefore seen as a sort of malicious saviour, and a lesson learned in not just being wary of one kind of person, trying to lead you astray. The adversary obviously failed in his mission to lead humanity entirely astray, as they could still be granted access into paradise, given they follow God's true teachings, whatever those may be. Of course, it wasn't really as easy as that, and there was plenty of more complicated, convoluted, and straight up malicious stuff hidden deep underneath those guiding principles, somewhere down in the system. But something like a guy still went a bit too hard against the very idea of it to be accepted by most people who were part of that particular church. That wasn't even mentioning how little most other major religions wanted to have to do with the church or its fringe groups. Unsurprisingly, none of them were particularly eager to be associated in any way with such a peculiar group of believers, who identified all other forms of worship as some form of misguided or sinning, even if that also was kind of what all other religions did. They just didn't proclaim it as publicly. Unless they did. It was complicated. Shaking his head after getting thoroughly lost in his own mind for a moment, and basically flashing back to his after-service days, when he still had delusions about being religious himself, James refocused on the conversation at hand with a few quick blinks. Anyway, I haven't gotten the all clear yet, but I'm pretty sure that we as humanity cannot quite afford the embarrassment of not showing up to a conference like this, after literally being invited by our own order for the first time. He continued his previous statement, after his suspiciously long pause. So I think I'll probably get to go. If not, I'll just remind them that I can go whether they want me to or not, basically putting them in front of the choice if they really want to let me go there all alone. Tuya nodded, seemingly ignoring the fact that he had drifted off for a minute there for his benefit, and then she tilted her head slightly. Well, if you go, you can take up to 10 people. Any idea on who you'll be bringing? She continued the conversation, seemingly determined to sound casual about the topic. Now, the golden question was if that was because she wanted him to bring her, or because she really didn't want him to bring her. James decided to just be honest about it instead of guessing around. Well, it depends a bit on how much support I get from the UHSTF, and who actually wants to come, but if I can safely bring people, I was thinking about bringing the whole squad, you know? Everyone involved with this, he explained, feeling like offering it to everyone and being declined was better than not offering it to someone who really wanted to come, potentially. I mean, you've all been through enough shit with me. I figure as long as we can make it safe, I should at least offer everyone the possibility to be there for something like this. Not that I really expect everyone to want to come. He left that last sentence sitting there, just in case Tuya needed an easy transition into her already declining his offer before it had even been fully made. However, it seemed that she was leaning more heavily in the other direction, which was probably not all too surprising with an adrenaline junkie like her. I'm game if you'll have me, she stated almost immediately. Got my record to clean after that last mishap back on Dunama. As if she needed to clarify what she was talking about. She used her hand to indicate towards the bandages around her neck, where the claw marks from said mishap used to be. James nodded and ran a hand through his stubbly beard. "Cool with me," he stated, although he glanced over at his sister, unsure how exactly she would take it that he planned to take her new girlfriend along for the ride, for yet another politically precarious mission. Nia did indeed look a bit worried as she shifted her lips. However, she quickly swept some of her loose braids out of her face and deposited them behind her ears as she sighed. "Well, I'd much rather have you two there to watch out for each other," she said, almost sounding a bit like she was still trying to convince herself of the truth of that statement, while her eyes remained closed with slightly trembling brows. Tuya took that as a sign to lean over and kiss her, to which James tastefully averted his gaze. "Speaking of watching out for each other," Tuya then spoke back up, while James was still looking away, his eyes getting caught on the moving pictures of the TV screen, even though he didn't really pay attention to what he was even looking at there. "How is Sheeda doing? I don't think I've seen her since she needed some alone time." James sucked in a bit of air through his teeth in a mixture of amusement and a desire to avoid the topic, but ultimately, he walked a few steps over to the backpack that he had brought with him to carry all of the index cards over. Picking it up, he reached his hand inside of the thing's dark maw and rummaged through it for a moment, feeling his hand bump against bottles, booklets and blocks, before finally grabbing a slightly torn up, loose piece of paper and pulling it out. The picture, there was a photo printed on regular paper, had multiple large, slightly scorched holes ripped into it that anyone with a bit of know-how quickly identified as bullet holes. Whatever it once showed was by now barely recognizable, as perforated as it was. However, with a lot of fantasy and goodwill, you could still somewhat make out the vague shape of one Captain Ferrimore Uton's face. "Her aim is getting better. The goggles certainly help," James tried to joke, as he held the picture up for all to see, although his humour was quickly overtaken as he sighed again and let it sink down, before also sitting himself down again. "Honestly, I think she's doing fine for the most part, but she could definitely use a bit of a distraction. Being cooped up like we are, her thoughts are circling a lot. I don't know if she is actually this angry at the captain, or if he just happens to be the current focus of all of her more undirected anger, but she's developing a bit of an unhealthy fixation. I hope getting her out of here will help with not having her mind getting stuck in place so much. I know it would certainly help me with that." Nia and Tuya both pulled a bit of a face as they looked at the picture that had been thoroughly shot to death, but they refrained from commenting a lot, knowing that James already knew what they were going to say. And indeed, James knew that other than distracting her, the best choice of action was most likely to also get her to therapy. The problem was, they didn't really have a Miette therapist or psychologist on hand around here, and getting one in was a bit hard with their current secure location. I wasn't even mentioning that any therapist not officially sworn in by the UHSDF would also have to be excluded from all classified information, making it kind of hard to talk with them about any of the currently ongoing topics, which are basically all classified. So that best of all options option was sadly hardly available to them. Maybe she could try having a talk with one of the human doctors, of course, but the effectiveness of that would be quite questionable at best. "Where is she now?" Nia then asked, instead of digging deeper into the topic. However, luckily, James could give a more relaxing answer there. "Oh, she's asleep," he informed, and leaned back slightly at the less tense topic. "With most people gone from the base, she's decided to return to her Miette rhythm for a bit, meaning she sleeps more all at once and less intermittently, since she doesn't really have humans to fall in line with right now. I don't particularly mind having to match up my awake times with her a bit more deliberately." Briefly after he had finished that sentence, his phone suddenly began to ring. "Might be the committee." James excused himself as he reached for the device and indicated for his company to please be quiet, with Tuya immediately reaching to mute the TV. After the volume in the room had died down, James lifted the phone to his ear. "Hello?" There was a quite heavy breathing on the other end that had a hint of a voice to it, of which James felt like he recognised it, although it didn't immediately come to him from where that was. That was, until the voice finally spoke. "Call it back," the voice said, in between laboured breaths, and the fear within it was palpable, as each syllable of the croaked statement quivered like a leaf in the wind. "Please." James had to furrow his brow, and briefly check the screen that told him that the call was coming from an unknown number, which shouldn't have been possible on a highly secured phone such as this one. Nobody should have the number who wasn't authorized to. With a flick of his thumb, he started a program that would record the phone call immediately. "Call what back?" James then replied, determined to keep the call going, while he also wondered where exactly he was recognizing that voice from. Meanwhile, his expression and demeanor had seemingly indicated towards Tuya that something wasn't right about the call, and she had quickly reached for her own phone to send out quick messages. "Your beast, James." The voice simultaneously clarified and didn't clarify at all. "Please call it back. I have nothing left to give you, so please, call it back." James furrowed his brow even further. He had no idea what this was about. Not in the slightest. "Beast? What are you talking about? I don't have a..." he began to say. However, it was in exactly that moment when his brain fired back up, and he finally knew where he recognized that voice from. "Wait. Councilman Ocote, is that you?" He was kind of baffled. Not only that the man would call him in the first place, but also at how in the world he would have gotten this number to do it. And he still had no idea what his beast was supposed to be. "Acting Councilman," Ocote corrected. "And even that not for long anymore. I'm withdrawing from the election for the next council, and will be facing the courts. You win. But please, call back your beast." James sat there entirely baffled, his brain not quite switching gears quickly enough to keep up with all the information he was being confronted with there. One of his captors was giving up. He was turning himself in. That was great, but why was he doing it? And what beast was he hoping James would have the power to stop? Apparently taking James's stunned silence as some form of denial of his request, the amphibian spoke back up, his croaking voice rejuvenated by a form of desperation that James had yet to hear from someone in the position of a councilman. "What else do you want?" he asked with a shaking voice. "I can't promise you any more than that. I don't know if you are hoping for me to reveal some big wealth of information, but I can't. All I can do is reveal what I worked on, and throw my own life away. No, I've already thrown it away. It's just catching up to me now. And I will face what I deserve for that. You can't demand any more of me. Please, I beg of you." James's brain finally fired back up, mostly because he had never expected that he would somehow suddenly feel so much pity for one of his former captors, and that based on his voice alone. The man sounded truly, deathly afraid. "Ocote, I have no idea what you are talking about," he gave back honestly, ready to work through it with the man to possibly figure out who had sicked something onto the man. However, the former councilman barely gave him time to say anything, before he basically howled in stifled agony that sounded mental in nature more so than physical. "Of course," he then said. "Of course you can't say either. Can't reveal anything. I get that. You can't admit to setting that thing onto me. Can't even admit to knowing it exists yet. I get that. Yes, I do. But you can still call it off, yes? Just give me some sort of message. Something that only I would understand. We talk so much, you have to think of something. Something that you can say to let me know that you're satisfied and that you'll call it back now, all right?" Had James not already been sitting, he would have likely had to sit down now. The sheer wave of terror that came out of his phone's speakers there was almost contagious. Granted, James wasn't terrified quite yet, but he could definitely feel the anxiety of not knowing what was going on, especially since his interlocutor seemed to be so utterly convinced that he had to know exactly what he was saying. To calm himself, James breathed deeply in, and exhaled and steadied his voice. "Just tell me what you are talking about, please," he gave back, in a regained tone of professionality, while he hardened his expression and brought his mind into an all-business mode in an attempt to work through this. "The AI!" Ocote basically yelled out in an exclamation. "You're beast! You used to be afraid of it as well. Told me not even humans would deal with them. But not anymore. Now that you've rallied yourself to its protection, you're the only one it could possibly listen to. I made a huge mistake, I know. I unleashed it upon the world. I thought I could prevent it from spreading, but instead I spread it all by myself. I can see why it would want my head, but I'm willing to own up to it now. I will stand my trial. And even if that's not enough for it has to be enough for you, right? You always said that's all you wanted. And if you call it back, it has to listen. It just has to." He trailed off in deep desperation towards the end, seemingly not quite able to convince even himself of that simple fact he has seemingly been clinging his entire sanity onto. The AI was his boogeyman, and he was basically putting his blanket over his head, trying to deeply trust that that would be enough to hold it off. And James was the blanket. "You were the one that ordered the attack on Dunama?" James asked a bit breathlessly, feeling like that confession he had basically just heard out of the man was way too good to be true. However, the fear of death might just be truly enough to get it out of a man like Ocote. "Yes," the former councilman immediately admitted. "Yes, it was me. I won't deny it. You can have this statement from me recorded, written. I will even draw you a picture. Just please, tell that beast to leave me be." Well, he had it recorded, so that was a good thing. Around him, he saw both Nia's and Tuya's eyes get incredibly wide after they had heard his statement, and he could see the burning questions on their lips, which they held back with a not insubstantial force of will. James sighed slightly. Most likely it would be his duty to try and wring the man dry for every drop of additional evidence or confessions he could get out of him. However, this didn't feel right. And that wasn't even to mention that, should it get out that James was, at least apparently, using a hostile AI to try and torture his political opponents into submission, then, well, Earth would have seen a time of peace for the last time. He couldn't risk giving off that impression at all. "Ocote, I don't know anything about an AI attacking you," he answered, hopefully truthfully. He would at least very much like to believe that Avesalon wasn't roaming around the free network and terrorizing people at this point, because he still very much would have liked to not have the entire galaxy immediately declare war on her. "Don't lie to me," Ocote pleaded with him, his voice losing force. "Reprique noticed it too. It's subtle, but it's there. Always there. Always letting you know that it could end you at an instant when it wants to, no matter where you go. I've already given all I could give. If you can't call it off, then I don't want to give it the satisfaction." Standing straight up from his seat, as soon as his brain had registered the subtext of that statement, James basically yelled out, Whoa, wait, okay? Wait. "We don't want to do anything hasty," he said, really not wishing this blood on his hands. Even if he wasn't actually the one instigating any of this, if he didn't act to the fullest of his ability here, he doubted that his conscience would care, or that he would be able to sleep again. Briefly calming himself with another breath, after he had been relieved to not hear the call end immediately, he then brought his voice back into a more gentle register, as he added, "Listen, I don't know anything about an AI attacking you or anything like that, but if you actually are turning yourself in, I can at the very least promise you to do anything in my power that you'll be treated fairly and kept safely until the time of your process comes around, okay? I promise you that I will do everything within my power to achieve that. Do you understand me?" He really hoped that that sounded enough like an encoded message of, "I will call my beast back," to ease the man's worries enough that he wouldn't do anything regrettable. There was a bit of heavy breathing on the other end of the line for a few seconds. However, ultimately, The former councilman replied, "I understand. Thank you, James." His voice was weak, almost like it had deflated into itself. James cleared his throat. "There is nothing to thank me for. I'm only doing what's right," he said genuinely, and rubbed the cool hand of his mechanical arm along his burning forehead to cool it down a bit while he also tried to decompress. "Just tell me one thing for now. How did you get this number?" Ocote didn't pause for long before he answered, seemingly worried James might retract his kindness again. "One of my associates gave it to me. The same one who first warned us about your beast," he explained. "He is good at getting around your systems." After he had said that, the connection suddenly cut, and James wasn't sure if Ocote had hastily hung up the call before James could demand any more information out of him, or if it had been cut by a third party. Basically dropping the hand holding his phone next to him, James sank back into his seat. It was a very strange feeling that filled him. This was a major victory. One of the biggest contributors to the shadow government they were fighting against was out of the game and admitting his crimes, and yet it felt so empty. Mostly because he didn't feel like he deserved any of it. Not that that would usually have meant much to him. These people needed to be stopped, and it didn't really matter if he contributed to it or not. He would just be happy if it was all over, one way or another. However, this way, it didn't feel right. And not just because he was ethically against it. No, but because these methods were so dangerous. Use of an aggressive AI was basically signing your own death warrant. Even a non-hostile one was dangerous enough as is. And if the attacks on Ocote, whatever nature they may have been of, actually stopped for now, then that meant the idea that James has something to do with it would gain validity, no matter how much he denied it. Whatever nature they may have been of. Avezalon couldn't actually have tried to attack him in any way. She just couldn't. After all, even after digitalizing, she was still entirely confined to the network of Dunima and its territories. Voluntarily so. Right? Although he held on to that hope tightly, and didn't really allow thoughts on the contrary to enter his awareness, the dark feeling of having made a deal with the devil was bubbling up within him, from somewhere deep inside, and he truly hoped that it was just trying to mislead him.